I'm Deborah Brown. I'm co-president of Grant Professionals of Lower Hudson, along with Maureen Fox. Would you wave? Thank you, Maureen. And I want to quickly thank our absolutely wonderful sponsors who make all this possible for all of us. And they are United Way of Westchester and Putnam, as well as United Way of the Dutchess and Orange region, Choice Words, Nonprofit Westchester, Executive Printing and Direct Mail, Lydia Howie Consulting, and all of our consultant sponsors. Thank you so very much. In case you didn't know, our educational events are generally eligible for GPCI credits. So if you're pursuing a GPC and perhaps even other credentials like CFRE, you are eligible for one GPCI credit after full participation in today's program. I'm going to turn this over to Michelle Neptune, our program committee chair. Take it away, Michelle.
Thank you, Deb. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Neptune, Program Committee Chair and Board Member at GPLH. Welcome to the GPLH webinar, The Complexities of Aligning a Grants Budget to its Proposed Intervention. I am thrilled to welcome all of you and our speakers, but before I do, upcoming programs are free for GPLH members. So our next Connections call for members only is scheduled for December 11th at 8:30 a.m. One of GPLH's founding board members and past presidents, Joanne Stewart, hello Joanne, will present once again on the Impact 100 grant application on 12/16, so December 16th, also at 8:30 a.m. And the due date for that, I just wanted to mention, is January 23rd of 2026. On January 15th at noon, we are welcoming a true grant professional thought leader, Allison Paul, to share information on what she's noticing as disappearing data from the federal government. So reliable data has been harder and harder to come by in this administration, and so she wants to discuss it. So I'm really interested in that. Also, if you are not a member and you paid for this event, we will happily apply the fee to your annual membership. So you can go to our website and sign up and just put save 30 is the code to put in the promo code little box. We will distribute an email with the recording and slides after this event to all registered participants. And the materials are always available on the GPLH members only section of the website. A survey will also be sent. The surveys really help us to get to know you and your needs, so please fill that out. It's very, very brief. It will only take a minute of your time. Thank you in advance. And a couple of house rules. Please refrain from using AI scribes. They kind of just mess with our system. Please mute yourself until the end and put your questions in the chat. We have two speakers today, and so they're going to try and take turns answering questions when they're not presenting, but also hopefully we have some time at the end. I know they have a lot of content. So that all being said, I'm thrilled and excited to introduce today's speakers. Helene Mantel has worked as the grants officer with the Austin and Union Free School District for the past 4 years. Helene oversees the New York State Education Department and U.S. Department of Education grants, including Title I, II, III, and IV grants, Universal Pre-K, My Brother's Keeper grants, and grants for special needs students. Before joining the school district, Helene spent 35 years with the Manhattan-based Institute of International Education, where she managed multi-million-dollar international grant and scholarship programs on behalf of corporations and private foundations. Helene holds a master's degree in international educational development with a specialization in bilingual education in Spanish from Columbia University Teachers College and a bachelor's degree in international relations and Spanish/Latin American studies from the American University. Jeffrey Winthal is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Foundation Relations at the United Way of Westchester and Putnam. In his role, he is responsible for all grant development and submissions. Jeffrey has applied for and been awarded various government, corporate, and foundation grants that have included projects in education, community health, mental health, substance abuse, basic needs assistance, community navigation, and program evaluation. In his spare time, Jeff has been finishing up his dissertation to receive his PhD in community research and action at Binghamton University. He holds a master's degree in psychology from Iona University and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Manhattanville University. So, you two are very impressive. So, thank you for joining us and please take it away.
All right, so welcome. Thank you for coming and good afternoon. Um, Today's session is going to be a little different, a little unorthodox because we're going to do a quick PowerPoint presentation and a few stop and shares. We're going to be showing you some forms. So how about let's get right to it then in that case. So, okay, and share. Okay, let me know if you see the document.
I can see it. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Does it matter if it's in this view or do you want the presentation mode? Does it make a difference for anybody? This is going to be a really quick PowerPoint, that's why. Okay. All right, so the title is The Complexities of Aligning a Grant's Budget to its Proposed Intervention. Budgets are, some people like budgets, some people don't. They could be dry or they could be really boring and tedious. So if you look at grant writing, for example, these are certain perceptions of grant writers or grant writing. So what nonprofits think a grant writer does, I guess kind of seems like a superhero. What the clients may see you as, like someone who just throws a bunch of money around. What society thinks you do, like, reading books at a library or doing some studying. What the family thinks you do is just a big question mark because they don't know what you really do. And then what do you think you do is that you're like a scribe, just doing the best you can. And what you really do, however, is that, yeah, it's just page counts, word counts, and then you really get down to nitty gritty. But when it comes to budgets, you may have a different view of this. You may love it. You know, I love budgets, right? You may love it, you may love doing it, or it may give you a migraine. It may give you a huge headache. You may just dislike it so much that you just want to get through it and throw it away when you're done. So for this session today, we have some learning objectives, and Helene's going to take it over from here.
Right. So as you see, the learning objectives of this webinar at the end of the session, we're hoping that you have a better understanding of the following areas: identifying a funder's budgetary requirements, connecting the proposed intervention to the budget, categorizing expenses, creating a budget narrative, recognizing potential roadblocks, and the vouchering and/or budget reporting process. A few pointers about the budgets. It's an ongoing process. So just because you prepare the budget at the very beginning of the grant application does not mean it's over. It goes on and on until the very end of the grant period. The funders usually indicate allowable and non-allowable costs, and it may include a set aside for what's called MWBEs, which is Minority Women Business Enterprises. And we'll speak a little bit more about that for the community-based organizations. The funder may request clarification. Well, it's not that they will request clarification regarding proposed expenses. It often leads to numerous modifications or iterations, so don't feel bad if the first budget does not get approved. And then the budget narrative is linked to the proposed intervention and, if applicable, a program evaluation. So for the examples for today's webinar, I will be speaking about the New York State Education Department application budget materials. So the budgetary forms used, the required budgetary categories, again, the MWBE documents, and matching or cost sharing, which is another concept that you may or may not be familiar with, and we'll discuss that. And then Jeff will speak about the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, the OCFS budget template, and the vouchering template. And that's quite different from the type of vouchering that we do here, for the New York State grants. So we're going to start. Let's see. Okay. So this is just an introduction of potential eligible costs that you'll see on the FS10 form, which we'll be showing you. And if you're preparing the budget, if you're doing the narrative, you just need to keep in mind what the budget is going to include. So even though you're working with words, you need to be able to apply what you're proposing to make sure that the budget aligns with that. So one of the main categories is salaries and wages, and then the other piece is fringe, which is benefits. So a lot of times when you'll submit a budget and people ask what are the the employee costs, you have to keep in mind that the benefits have to be included with that. Because as you can imagine, that's a large chunk of change. And if you don't include that, your budget could be, sort of off, and you don't want that to happen. Contractual is what we pay to the consultants, to the providers of benefits, or providers of services. Then there's the travel. If there's a travel component, whether it's staff travel or consultant travel, equipment, if that's allowed. For most of the grants that I work on here, we don't really purchase equipment, so I'm not very familiar with that. Also with the space, property, and utilities, that doesn't apply to the grants I have, but Jeff might be able to speak more about that. Operating expenses, and then other. So those are sort of the general categories that are covered in a budget. Again, you'd have to look at the RFP to see exactly what the grant will cover, but this is sort of an overview of what most of these applications will cover. Next.
Yep. These are the ineligible costs.
Right. So there are also ineligible costs. And again, you'd have to go through the RFP. Certain salaries and wages are not covered. They may not cover fringe benefits either for the people who are working on the grant or for others. Again, with the contractual, they don't always pay, or they rarely pay for any costs associated with the preparation of the grant application, so you'd have to check that. Travel costs, what will they allow with travel, whether it's economy travel or do they allow business travel? The purchase of equipment, a lot of times if you buy a cell phone or a tablet, they want that returned to the grantee or to the funder. The space, property, and utilities, again, that may not be covered along with the operating expenses and other, like the purchase of food. That's a perfect example, at least for grants supported by the state. They do not allow food. The only thing that they will allow is refreshments. And I've learned that the hard way. So you really need to make sure you understand what will the funder cover, because you don't want to be in a position where you've spent all this money and then you realize after the fact that it's not covered.
And to add on to it, Helene, for indirect costs, a not-for-profit or a community-based organization may want to charge 10 to 15% of their indirect for operating costs just to cover their overhead. It's important that whoever is looking at the RFP or RFA or whatever that solicitation is, to make sure if it's distinguished between, okay, is indirect covered or not. So that's important to make sure that's pointed out, because that can definitely skew your budget a bit.
Right, and indirect costs, I just know I have a perspective from my previous position with my old job where we had private foundation funding, and it wasn't exactly called indirect costs, but you may be familiar with G&A, which is general and administrative, and it's the same concept. It's okay, who is working on this program that is not charging directly to the grant, that we can absorb some of the cost, whether it's the grant writer, whether it's the person in HR, who does the HR work. It's sort of the behind the scenes that are required to complete the project, but you can't charge for it. So conceptually, it could be indirect or it could be called G&A. I don't know if there are other terms for that, but in the private world, it's pretty much G&A. Um,
And then we have using contractors. So you could do a program evaluation where it's someone who is a researcher or someone who can collect data or do data analysis, where they're independent external to the entire project. So that's to avoid any kind of bias whatsoever. They usually come in with someone like a blank slate, as they say, where they come in fresh with a fresh point of view. Um, how much the program evaluator usually costs is typically 6 to 10% of an overall budget. Now you may be thinking like, oh, okay, that this budget is only worth $10,000, and it doesn't make sense to do a program evaluation. That's something you have to build into it, I suppose. But if you have a $1 million budget, spending 60,000 to or $80,000 on your program evaluation would be really beneficial in this case, because you want to know if your project's effective or not. And if anything is, or disarray along that period of time. Let's especially if it's like a 3-year grant. You want to know like after 1 year if things are working out or you need to make some adjustments. And the program evaluator could do that for you. And then they would measure fidelity, which is everything being done as said, originally, proposed. And then they measure effectiveness, which is your impact. And then you get lessons learned and recommendations, for any mid-course adjustments. And then for MWBEs, this would be in the RFE or RFP. It could be 15%, it could be 30%, it could be for the entire overall budget. So let's say if it's $100,000, they may just say 30% of the entire budget, so 30,000 has to go towards MWEs. And there's usually a cutoff, like 10% for minority business enterprise and then 20% for the women's business enterprise. They'll state how that gets cut down. Or you can find an organization that has both certifications. And then purpose of having MDBs is to meet a need that your organization or I guess your client in this case or program does not have, and they can help supplement that need. And it also requires completing good faith efforts, which we can discuss a little bit later. And then we have potential roadblocks. It could be misalignment with the funder's guidelines, not putting enough money for the MWBs because it's not necessarily required, but there's a minority women's business enterprise office at the state, depending on the department, and they will stay on top of you to make sure you meet their goal. If you only doing 10% only and you want 30%, they're going to haunt you essentially and say, okay, what's going on here? How come you're not meeting that extra 20%? And you have to give a really good valid reason as to why. Including allowable costs. Helene mentioned this, food, for example. Food is a bit tricky because if you're doing a program that's, let's say, like culinary arts, and you need to purchase food for cooking lessons or demonstrations, that may be covered, but that depends on the funder, though, because it's attached to a learning experience. But just buying snacks or buying meals, that's typically not covered. And in the budget proposed project, they're not aligned. So whatever you're proposing, it's not aligned to your budget, especially with the narrative as well. And then not allocating enough funds for fringe or indirect costs. And then forgetting to include a fiscal match if that's required. So sometimes that your funder may require a matched cost. They may just say, look, you have to put 25% into your budget that you're gonna have to pay for. Let's say it's for $1 million. They want you to give 250,000 out of your own pocket, and they'll cover the 750. So and that's required too as well. That's how they would do it. And then it helps to develop additional revenue streams for sustainability. So that's pretty much that.
I can jump in with just a couple of other comments about the MWBE. We don't want to focus on that, but it is quite important because at least on the state level, they do require that. And the tricky part with an MWBE is you might feel like, or you contract or you want to work with a certain organization, and you know that the owner or the proprietor is a minority or a women owned business. That doesn't qualify unless they're registered. So that's sort of the key piece of this. They have to be registered on I don't know if it's a New York State or federal registration process. And it's quite tedious. So, at least here in Austin, we work with a lot of minority businesses, but they're not official, so we can't really use it. We can't use them for that portion. So that's one of the tricky parts of the MWBE. I don't want to go into too much detail, but we would just fill out forms. It's not as if we have to comply. So for the grants that we have it has to be 30% of the total, but you can get a waiver. So it's not like you have to find vendors because for the work that we do, at least in the school district, there aren't that many vendors. These vendors, I think, were first created or sought for large contractors, but for a school district, they don't really apply. So it's always very tricky. So we do try to comply with it, but then you can fill out lots of forms, which we won't share with you because you don't want to see all the forms. But it's not like if you don't get the 30%, you won't be qualified for the grant. You just need to request the waiver. And then for the matching funds, I think that's also another important piece. especially for those of you who are responding to RFPs, it's an important piece to read to make sure, is there a matching requirement? Because it's not always so obvious. They sort of just integrate that into the RFP. But we've had two grants recently where we had the matching. One was at 100%, and then the other was at 25%. The one at 100% was like $153,000. And then the other 25% was for a grant that was over 600,000 a year. So it all depends on who's funding this. But for the matching, just to give you an example of what can be used for matching, and that could be staff salaries. Like, for example, the work that I do on behalf of these grants, I'm not charged to the grant. So the work that I do with the hours that I spend are considered matching. For one of the programs, just one other example, since we are a school district, our high school works with the Naviance program, and many of you may be familiar with that. For the high school students, it's for college applications. So it's a program on a portal that we pay a chunk of money for the high school. So a portion of that was for one grade, which was for this grant. So we were able to use that as matching. So you sort of get creative with the matching, and that's what they tell you, because initially it sounds shocking that, whether it's the school district or a small not-for-profit or whoever you're working for, they don't necessarily have cash to just give as the matching portion, but it's sort of in kind. That's another term that's used for matching. What can you donate on behalf of the program that may not necessarily, cost money, but be a service that you can offer? So that's just a little more on matching.
Okay. All right. Should we get to the forms?
Sure.
All right. I'm going to stop sharing. And like I said, it's going to be, we'll do this a few times. Okay. Let me pull that document up. Share. Okay. Let me know if you see this document.
Sure. So this form, and I give total credit to Jeff, who decided to go the Sesame Street angle. But this is not a form. This is not how I submitted it to New York State. However, this is what's called an FS10 form, and it is very specific to state and federal grants. So we use that here in the school district, both for our state grants, which includes the UPK program, and then the federal grants, which includes the title grants, the titles 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you may not be all familiar with that, but what I found with this FS10 is that even though it's specific to the state and federal grants, it's a really good template to use for any sort of budget that you're preparing, because it does incorporate everything. So if we go to the professional staff salaries, this one, was for our UPK program for the school district. So let's see, professional.
There you go.
Right. So here, obviously the numbers have all been changed, but when we prepare this, we have to list every single teacher, every single staff person who is going to be charged to the grant. And you need to put in, like you can see, for most of them, it's at 100%. For some, it's at a different percent. So when you're preparing these budgets, even if you're not preparing the budget, if you're the grant writer, you need to know the narrative behind it. So, the budget will support 10 full-time teachers, 2 half-time teachers, a quarter of the principal. So you're putting words to this budget. So that's why you work very closely with the budget, even though you might think you have nothing to do with the budget, you do. So you incorporate, all the staffing, and I guess you would work with your colleagues who are applying for the grant to get that background as to, who do you plan to support. And the key piece, and I think this was brought up before, you have to be realistic and make sure that you include everybody, because a lot of times people are forgotten and you didn't realize that you needed, I don't know, the database person, a portion of that person's time to help with collecting data. If you don't put it in the budget, you're obviously not going to get the support for that. So this is what they call professional staff salaries. And then the next is the support staff. And I think this was designed, just because of their coding at New York State. I don't quite know why, but they have different codes. So here you'll see it's a code 16. So when we do all the reporting internally, we know how much was spent for support staff, how much was spent for professional staff, and then we can we can move on to the next tab. So this is for basically the vendors. So for the UPK program, the example is we work with a community-based organization that provides the services as well, because the UPK grant requires that a chunk of the money goes to a community-based organization along with the district. So that's where, this funding comes into play. You'll see here we do work with an MWBE. It happens to be a woman-owned music company. So we're able to allocate $14,040 towards MWBE. That is not sufficient, for the total amount that we're required. So we also request a waiver. So you can do both. You can have some money that goes for the MWBE and then some, that you do for the waiver. This is another piece of this is you have to be as descriptive as possible. So if we were to just say, consultants, for example, for a description, it would come back and they would want more information. I didn't put the name of the bus company, but when we're doing these applications, we have to be as detailed as possible, because they will come back and ask, and they want to know how many, they want to know how much per expense. So you can't be general about that. And then going on for supplies and materials. Again, here, you know, you can't just say supplies. I've tried it. I've learned the hard way with these forms. They want as much detail. At least here, they haven't come back and said how many books. And I kid you not, they've come back and asked, others have come back and asked, how many books, how much is each book, when you don't really know. You just know that the schools are going to, purchase supplies. So when you're submitting this, you don't have all the details. Luckily, for this one, they allowed it to be general, but others have come back and asked for more details. For the travel expenses, again, so for this grant, and what's interesting here, we put in TBD, and I can tell you that that will come back because it just came back from one that I submitted, and it was the names of the teachers. They wanted to know specifically what teachers were going to go to the conference, and we don't know because the conference is in August of 2026. And they came back and said, okay, you don't have to list the names, just take out TBD. You can't put in TBD. So just a little piece of advice, don't put TBD. Again, as much detail as you can. And as you can see, this is broken down. You can't just say, and I did this, X number of dollars total times 3 teachers. No, they want it broken down. How much is the hotel? How much is the airfare? How much is the registration? So again, the more detail, the better it is. And then the next. This is the fringe, the benefits. And again, for Social Security, that's across the board. So everybody, it's 0.765%. So you would have to include that on top of all of the budget for the entire amount of the salaries. That's not what's listed here because just in terms of this form, because the grant only covered a certain amount of money. So you have to mix and match. But if you're planning the budget and it's, you would you would calculate how much all the salaries are and then calculate the Social Security. And then the other pieces are the benefits. And this would change depending on who you're working with. Here in the district, the teacher's retirement is this percentage. And, that would be different for everybody. The health insurance, we didn't put anything in because the budget couldn't cover it. But this gives you an outline of what would need to be included in the budget if you were helping to prepare the budget. Then the indirect costs for hours, again, the district does not apply for any indirect costs on our grants. It was just a decision made. I don't quite know why, but they don't go for the indirect costs.
Oh, sorry.
And For BOCES, that's another budget line item that sometimes we use, sometimes we don't. And again, these are very specific forms, just for these grants. We don't do any remodeling, we don't get funding for that, and we don't get funding for equipment. But this just gives you that idea of what potentially, could be supported, and you could use this template to create your budget. And then the final tab would be the summary. I think there's a final.
Yep, trying to get
There
to
we
it.
go.
Yep, sorry.
There we go. So this takes all the tabs and totals it. And that's what's really helpful about this form, because you get the overview. So you see that the total is 1,469,40, and then it's broken down by this. So, if you're preparing a budget, it's a simple way of creating a budget with most of the categories that are covered by most of the grants. Obviously, each grant will be very specific and you can add to that, but it's a helpful template. And I've used this for grants that are not funded by the state or the federal government, just to have an idea. I use this for our Mother Cabrini grant application, just to get a good overview. So that's the FS10 form. So I think there were some questions. I don't know if we want to answer those questions now or if we should wait.
I think they were answered. Does anyone have a question that they would like to unmute themselves since we have 1 minute? Nope. Okay, I think we can move on. I don't see any hands.
All right. Next, we'll go to the next one. Yep.
Okay. And then what is generally required with the state and federal grants is the budget narrative. And this is something that I think would pertain even more to the audience, because it's the words behind the budget. And like I mentioned before, you'll see here we have the total amount of money that was allocated for salaries broken down, and they want to see this. And, how many teachers at 100%, how many at what percent, and here, Jeff gave a very creative explanation of what the funds are being used for. I haven't done that. I've just sort of broken it out with the numbers, but I think obviously the more information and explanation you can provide, the better it is. But the key piece here is to make sure that the narrative matches the budget, because if it's off, they will come back and they will say, you said that you're supporting 100% teachers, and your narrative says 9. And it's very easy to, I don't even want to say make a mistake, but when you're doing different versions, to forget to align this narrative piece with what you've put on the FS10 and or whatever budget template you use. So this is something maybe everybody here would prepare because it is the narrative, but you also need to understand the why behind it. So, if you know that the students are going to go home from the zero sugar baking program, who is going to support them and how much you're going to pay for the buses. So, again, it's sort of an overview and a narrative to go along with the budget. And I have to say that this is so important for a grant application, because the narrative could be really wonderful and exciting and exactly what you think what they're looking for. They always go to the budget, and it always has to make sense, and they will come back and ask lots of different questions. So this just gives you an example. It's just the narrative behind the numbers.
Yeah, for the budget narrative, you want to be detailed as possible, because you'll get dark points if you're not detailed enough for the reviewers. I believe we'll go with this one.
Yeah.
Okay. Next one. Given the time, do you want to go to the FS10F or you want to go for another one?
We can just do it very quickly. I'll go very quickly just to show sort of the end
You got it.
result. So you all saw the initial FS10, which was what we were proposing. This is what's called an FS10F, which is the report at the end of the grant. So we're reporting on all expenditures. So it basically replicates the FS10 in terms of, what we were going to support. But for us, we have to give all this detail. We have to give the name. I didn't put names here, obviously, but the names and then the dates and how much was paid for each person. And then you see the total amount on top. That's how much we paid for professional salaries. That's how much we paid for support staff. And then if you compare it, and we don't have to do that now, but if you compare it to the FS10, some is a bit over, some is under, and then depending on each grant, do they allow that? Do they allow you to go off by 10%, which is what happens with the state and federal grants? Or, will you just have to incur the cost of whatever you went over? So this is sort of the culmination of the entire grant. And for us in the district, when we submit this is what generates the payment at the end. So the grant is over. They've paid us X number of dollars up through the end of the grant. They never pay you everything before the end of the grant. There's a portion that remains, and then this is what generates that. So this is sort of like our quote unquote voucher. Um, so that's the FS10F. I don't want to spend too much time, but that's sort of the end, come full circle. And then this, I just wanted to show a different example of a report, because this is what we prepared for the Higher Education Services Corporation, and this is federally funded. So this actually represents the grant where we had 100% matching. And see here, Elmo is in charge. So, it's a fun program. But for the request for payment, that tab. So here, as an example of how you get paid, so for this particular grant, we have the total amount of the grant, how much we've spent, and what remains. And this is what generates the payment of the grant for this particular project. So again, every grant has a different method and a different way of paying. We prepare this report, submit it, and then we get paid based on what number 6 here, where it says amount of funds requested for final payment. That's how we get the payment. For the budget summary, this is all the next tabs that you see all put together. So again, it's sort of the overview of how much have we spent for the program in terms of staff salaries. And again, if you think back to the FS10, this is a different project, but the concept is the same. It's salaries, it's programmatic work, it's benefits, travel. But this particular grant, they want a lot of information on each person. So you can't just say, one staff person at, 10%. They want to know all the details. And then here you see they want to know the purchase order number, the check number, the ACH number, the date that you did it, everything. So again, each grant has different requirements. This one happens to be an enormous amount of reporting. So going back to when you're preparing the grant application, you need to know what they're going to be reporting on financially, because you put that into the application as part of the narrative. So you can't say, well, I didn't know what they were going to be supporting, because if you help to write the grant application, you sort of know what the expenses are going to be. If you could go back to the final expenditure budget summary, just to show you, so you have the program expenses, and then again, like I said, this is the grant that had the matching expenses. We had to account for all the matching expenses and report on it, because we're required. If we don't have the required matching, then we're not compliant and we won't be paid. So we have to report on this. We have to have documentation to support all the matching. You don't want to know the details, but we do have to report on it, and then you see the total amount of the grant. I think that's it. This just gives you another template of a type of budgetary report that the federal government requires. So this is different from the FS10. And then,
Okay. All right, I think we have two more. The one I'm going to show you next is through the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. It's through their after-school program, statewide program, where you do after-school programming for kids, thinking like academic enrichment, social emotional learning, STEAM, serve those kind of services to help, I guess, improve, scholastics. So what I'm gonna do is share my screen and should be able to see it now. So this is a budget that OCFS uses for this particular grant. It's different from the FS10 that Helene had mentioned. This one's probably not so bad. Like this, it's a little more easier to work with. So you have salary, you have fringe, and this is like the summary for all the documents put together. And how this one works is that number of children that you serve gives you a certain amount of cost for the budget. So even I have like 180 here. If I were to change to let's say 100, that number will go down to 350,000. So it depends on how many students or how many children can be served for an after-school program or daycare, whatever it may be. You have salary and fringe, number of staff per title, salary per person, and then the percentage that you're going to be using that person on that project. So, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. In this case, the fringe here is set at 35%. So let's say if this is for a not-for-profit. So just keep that in mind that sometimes it could be less, it could be 20%, it could be 25. In this case, this one is 35%. And then the amount of fringe is right here for 91,000. This document here is to replace the narrative per se. Now we showed the budget narrative where you get really detailed. OCFS kind of provided this for you. Now, in the actual application, the actual narrative, you would really be detailed in there too. But in this case, you're going to specify what or each person or each title is going to be doing. And they actually gave you different kinds of roles. So they have the project director, you put a little X based on what they're going to be doing. So direct care and staff development or hands-on training, curriculum development, lesson planning, and so on. You have the chief confection officer, so same thing. Plans, develops program activities, attends school-age childcare and program activities. You have the site coordinator and so on. So it's a very straightforward sheet. You just need to know exactly what the roles and responsibilities are of each person that's going to be working on that project. And then they would check up on this too as well. They'll even ask, is this person doing X, Y, and Z? And is there anything other than that's listed that person should be doing or is doing that you haven't mentioned as well? You have consultants. You have a positive development consultants. That could be like dance, arts-based activities or crafts. It could be fitness, and whatever it is. You have also the program evaluation for that amount. So I think this equals 200,000. And then here you have a budget narrative for the consultants. You would actually add what it is they're doing exactly. You have travel. This could be for, let's say, for the project director or any staff that's going to go to a conference and cover the mileage. Again, budget narrative is below. Same thing. Equipment. One thing I want to mention about equipment is that depending on the grant opportunity or the funder, they may put a stipulation in the RFE, RFP that equipment may be equivalent to a certain amount. So under equipment, it's any item that's worth $5,000 or more, or it could be $1,000 or more. Anything less what they said will go under supplies. And then if, let's say you made that mistake when you submitted the application, they may come back and tell you to change that. If you're awarded. You have supplies here, program supplies. It's very broad, but then you have the budget narrowed on bottom, which explains it and what they are. And then you have other. Other is indirect, for example, which is quite high, but this one has a 15% indirect cost. It's pretty much right off the top. And you have professional development, which is training for the staff, and then you have recruitment outreach, so recruiting students and families to participate in the program. And then indirect costs are explained here. So accounting support, payroll services, IT, administrative support by staff who are such as Vouchering, who are not directly working the program but working behind the scenes, and so on. And you have almost promotions who are doing recruitment outreach. And then we have one more document. Last one coming up is the vouchering document that OCFS uses. This is an internal document that OCFS uses with their awarded grantees. So they give you instructions on what to do here, but it's quite self-explanatory. I'll go through it. So you have based on the month, and so they give you how much money you have per, I guess, line item or per staff member, and it gives you the approved amount. And then you make a claim each month. So you will fill this out each month, month by month, and then you will submit it to the program officer or the contract manager. And then they will approve it, and then they cut you the check. They send you the money. And then if you have any questions, they'll come back to you. Now, obviously, these numbers are very, I guess, homogenous. So there's no really diversity with these numbers because they're all the same. They may look different depending how much time the staff member worked during that time. So there may be more variability here, but this is just for an example in this case. And then in the very last row was kept empty. And then you have the remaining against budget. So if I were to put that same budget right there to finish it off, that should equal zero, and then so on. And that'll be, the final claim. And then you go into the next year and so on. And then that's pretty much it for the claims process. And then you can put details here for any consultants that you're working with and how much you have to reimburse them. And if you have to make any kind of adjustments, there's a process to give you directions to follow, but the contract manager typically works with you hand in hand on how to do that. And there's a form that you have to fill out. These are like budget modifications, as we call them. That's probably the best way to put this. And then you would justify as to why you're doing that. Maybe you had a staff member leave, or maybe you need to hire someone because you have a need that hasn't been met yet because the program evaluator found something that you haven't seen. So there could be many reasons as to why. And that's it. That's it for the forms.
I had just two more comments. One on something that I think is very important that I've noticed in grant applications, and it has to do with the budget, but it relates to sustainability. So we're always asked, how do you plan to sustain this activity or whatever you're doing that you're getting the grant funds for? Because the funders always want to know, they want to make sure that you can continue the project after the funding ends. So it's an important piece, especially as the grant writers, because this may not be a question that the grantee has thought about, but it's important to put in, and it's important to put in because others may not. So if you can show, how they plan to sustain this project after the fact, I think that makes it even stronger. And just to give an example from the school district in terms of sustainability, and I'm sure you've all heard, what's been going on, but during COVID, school districts got thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in aid to support mental health providers or, some academic intervention supports. And that was wonderful for the few years that you got the funding. So they ramped up the staffing, they ramped up the services, and then the funding stopped. And so, the school districts around the country were all hit with how do we sustain this? So it's sort of an exaggerated example of what can happen if you don't come up with a sustainable plan. So that I just think that that's an important piece. And I've noticed it in a lot of applications, how are you going to sustain this? And it seems like they keep asking in different ways. So, that seems to be a very important part. And then the other, I just thought it might be helpful when we apply for these grants and we don't get them, they do a technical review and they will come back and tell you what your score was and tell you what weaknesses and strengths. So for a couple of grants that we submitted and did not get, I just thought I would share with you the comments on the budget to give you an idea of what they're looking for. So for one grant, they said the strengths, the budget narrative is clear and aligned with the project design. The LEA, which is the school district, provided justifications for expenditures. Weaknesses. We did not adequately provide cost breakdowns for proposed expenditures. The LEA, us, did not adequately describe how expenditures met the supplement, not supplant requirements. We did not comprehensively describe its multi-year expenditures. So as hard as that is to listen to, at least it's constructive criticism. And then the last comment for a different grant, while the budget seemed complete and realistic, there were some details that seemed to be lacking, such as a clarification of how 25% will be allocated to concrete family needs and clarification of how 50% is for direct services versus 50% for administrative and other expenses when the numbers don't appear to match. So I'm just giving you that background of what they're looking for and how important it is to be very specific and exact. So the narratives were great, but the budgets didn't fit the bill, so we didn't get it.
Thanks, Helene. Those are great. That was a great idea to include that. Does anyone have any questions for Jeff or Helene? I had a quick one while we're waiting. Jeff, when you submit those claims forms, do you need to add all the, appropriate documentation that shows that that's okay? So you're working really closely with your finance people, finance department to get all of this information.
Yep.
And I just wondered how much of your time do you and Helene, do you think that you are spending sort of overseeing all of this aspect just to make sure the grant funds are being spent in the way that you intended and that the grant intends?
It's a good amount of time. Grant administration or management can definitely take a lot of time. The claims itself can be timely because it's often this come like it's a give and go relationship with the contract manager. They'll come back and say you need to fix this one number because it's incorrect. Fix it, and then they could take like a week to get back to you. And you're just like you're kind of like at their mercy. I hate to say it like that, but you are. And then
So
you have
ask
to
early and often is what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, as
Yeah.
best as possible. And
Mhm.
but they are there to help you. If you have any questions, you definitely be proactive about it, and their job is to be as helpful as possible.
I would say a lot of my time is spent monitoring the expenses, which is interesting because, if you're the grant writer, you're not necessarily the business person. I do represent the business office for the grant. So I spend an enormous amount of time and a lot of with the reporting. So that's why, I keep emphasizing how detailed and how specific everybody needs to be because, and I've noticed just even over the past year or so, the accountability is so much stronger now. I think maybe it was a little more flexible right after COVID. They allowed certain things because now I'm getting pushback on things that were allowed in the past. And, the response can't be, well, you allowed this the past 3 years because you don't want them to go back. Um, but but it's true, things that were allowed, and it's not like we weren't in compliance, but they're monitoring every single payment or every single dollar down to the penny. If the percentage is off, I've been off by $1 and I'm telling you they've sent it back. I have to go get a new signature. Yeah. And it's pretty intense. So, thoroughness and just looking at it with sometimes I have to put it down and come back to it because it's too many numbers at once. So,
And
Uh,
then when they're giving you feedback, say it's early on, you've just submitted, and their first, response to you is, I don't like how you, described XYZ in the budget. Does that generally mean that you think that you got the grant, or because why would they be taking the time? Or is that typically come after you've been approved for the grant and you know that you've gotten it? Jeff's shaking his head, so.
yeah, like if you are awarded a grant, they'll come back and say you need to fix, these 10 things. If you're not awarded a grant, they're going to tell you they'll give you the kiss off letter. Thank you for applying, and better luck next time. But typically, the awardee is going to have to go through a long, tedious process, and you're going to be working with a program officer or the contract manager together, and you're going to be fixing a lot of things, to their standards. Because when we as grant writers, when we put in these applications in, especially the budget, it's most of the case it's not to their standard because they have a certain way of doing things at the state or in a government office, for example. I'm using government here because they have a process. And They don't necessarily give trainings on what their process is like. They try to, but they usually don't. And it's something that we have to learn on the way as we go along. We have to make a lot of mistakes along the way so we can actually learn them. And that's from my experience when working with the state in this case. Um, but
Yeah.
I, I would say with when you work with like OCFS or state ed or other state agencies like Department of Labor, the good thing about these different state agencies or any government agency is that the processes are very similar to one another. So you're not necessarily kind of like reinventing the wheel, or you're not going to be deviating so differently from one budget to another. The information should be nearly the same. It's just the formatting may look different, and
Right.
that's really it. And you have to kind of get used to that.
Right. And that's sort of why we were showing you the forms. But I agree with Jeff. But for here in the district, it's a little bit different with the title grants and for some others because they're allocated to us. It's not like it's a competitive process. They tell us this year the school district gets X number of dollars, but we still have to submit this huge application. So in terms of making changes, they will come back and say, and I just did this with the title grants, and they come back with lots of different comments because it has to align with each title, like the Title I requirements, Title II requirements, and they're all different for each title. So they work with you. And this is something that I learned because when I first started, I was petrified that, I did it wrong and the district isn't going to get its money and that's it. And that's not what happens. They work with you. They want this to work. So as much back and forth that there is, it's not like for us, it happens before we get the grant because they won't approve it in the portal until we've written everything according to the way that they want it. With others, like for example, with the Mother Cabrini, and that's not a federal, that's a private foundation. Um, they do the review, and the program officer was in touch, and it wasn't changing the application, it was providing supplemental information. So they would ask questions, and then we would respond. And he did it in such a way that he would ask the question in a way that I had to answer the way he felt it was the best way to answer to give us a better chance. So I think it's always very different, and it also depends on the type of funding that you're getting. Um,
Thank you, Helene. Yeah, that's excellent information on budgeting. I see that some people do have to jump off, so if you do, thank you so much for joining us. If you do not and you have a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself or type your question in the chat. I know we're getting, oh, it is 1 o'clock right this minute. Okay.
To piggyback what Helene mentioned about the minority women's-owned businesses, the Empire State Development has a list of certified minority and women's-owned businesses that can be selected from. If you ever have to work with a minority women's-owned business because the budget requires it, or you have to have that set aside in there, that's the list that you want to go to, or you need to make sure that they are a certified business, a certified minority or women's-owned business. Because if you don't do that, that's going to really counter your budget. Whoever your funder is, especially like at the state level, they're going to say that this doesn't count, and you're going to have to go back and fix a lot of stuff. That's like a big headache waiting right there. You got to go back and fix the narrative, the budget itself, and how the contractor is supposed to supplement the services that's going to help your project in general. So it's very
Yeah.
systemic.
Thank you for pointing that out. I know the MWBE can be a headache for many people, so we could probably do an entire program just on that.
I
All
was
right,
always
so
thinking that it would be great to have not us, but there are services out there that will help MWBE, well, organizations that aren't officially MWBE get certified because it's a huge benefit for them financially. Um, but for most of these organizations, they don't have the resources because you need to have a lawyer, you need to have an accountant, you need to put together all this paperwork and submit it, and it's a whole process. So they're unable to do that. And it really is very unfortunate because there's so many really good, solid MWBE providers, especially here in Ossining, that could benefit. It could be a boon to their business. And, they don't have the resources to get sort of official or certified or whatever, which is too bad.
I just
I'd
wonder
like to
federally
I'd like
if
to
they'll
just
even
jump
keep
in
it.
and tell a fast story. So I have a client, you probably all know them, Teton Lake Reservation. They
Sure.
won a $3.9 million grant for the ZBGA, Zoos Botanical Gardens. Well, in the RFP, there is absolutely no mention whatsoever of MWBE. The original budget sent in had labor included. Well, guess what? They were going forward. They picked their contractor. He's not MWBE. It was 100% match. We had to come up with 3.8 million on the 1.9 or something like that for it. The contractor had, we did manage to get the 4 million all in non-labor. So we did everything from light bulbs. Some of you may or may not be aware, T-Town is going through a $27 million
Right,
expansion
right,
and renovation of their entire property. So lucky for them, they had enough, quote, versus staffing. So that's how we got around it. And by the way, in all the years I've been writing for 25 years, I have never had anybody, not one client, ever be able to fulfill. And I'll just give you an example. One was for Gilda's Club years ago. Well, there was no MWBE social worker, oncology social worker in like the entire state of New
right.
York. So, but it is an intensive process to prepare the paperwork and get, quote, that exemption. Okay, so don't, it's not to scare anybody. It's able to be done. And I have done it for those clients every single time. It's just a little time consuming to prepare that paperwork. But you will get, if you can't find someone on the list in New York State, or by the way, on the list who has the right price. T-Town again had an incident where person they wanted to use was 1/4 of the price that the MBW, well, we documented how this was just not feasible. They wanted more than the grant was worth, okay? For the MWBE, they did give
Wave.
the exemption. So it's just you got to be diligent, and it does take a month or two to quote go through the process. So don't give up with that. But most times you can I don't want to say get around. There's a reason for the whole MWBE program, and it's a good reason for it. But Helene and Jeff brought up a lot of issues that a lot of people are not like in Ossining are just not on the program. They can't afford it. They to get on whatever the process is. It's too complicated for them, to
Lydia,
register.
Lydia, can I just ask, are you saying that even if a grant doesn't specify that you have to have the 30% MWBE for your
No,
subcontractors,
it's
you still
just
do?
don't be surprised if it shows up after your grant, is what I'm saying.
And then you
Okay.
have to go talk to Lydia about
You
budgeting magic and
absolutely
how
no
to get
mention of
around that. Yeah.
MWBE. They get the award, and then all of a sudden the emails are coming and it says MWBE. And I was about to kill myself because I had done the budget for T-Town and we were putting in labor. I knew they had already picked the contractor who was not an MWBE person. So no labor, none of his labor could be counted for on a $4 million grant. But we managed to, not me, but the contractor managed to pull, I'm not kidding you, there are light bulbs and all kind of rental of, scaffolding and all kind of stuff. But I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I guess I should have probably sent an email, but sometimes they don't know. I mean, when I was told back when I applied a year ago that there wasn't going to be an MWBE requirement, and then all of a sudden it just showed up after we got this award. And by the way, I would say if you want to be cautious, just say 99% of the time New York State is going to require an MWBE. Just assume if your grant doesn't say it, just assume that it's going to be. You're better off telling your client or your agency that, listen, we're going to have to pick somebody or let's put in hard costs, no labor.
Interesting. Well, Jane, I see that your hand has been raised. Do you have a comment or question?
Yes, well, first of all, I wanted to comment on what has just been said. We applied for a grant recently, and we wanted to provide some kind of compensation stipend for these very young volunteers who would be doing the work. And we were told that the grant would not allow it. And so we were like, oh, and we were ready to sort of hold our tents on that one. But then we were advised, oh, but wait, you can use gift cards. So there are,
That's
there are
what I was
different
going to say.
ways.
Get gift cards because if they're too young, there's a whole labor thing. So gift
Yeah,
cards are great. Yeah.
yeah. So, but we would not have known this. Somebody who was more experienced with this type of grant had to, advise us that we weren't stuck. There was something we can do. And my other suspicion, and I can only call it that at this point because I'm new at this, and so maybe some of you have some perspective to offer. The grantor very rarely will answer a question directly. It comes at you sideways. And I feel like sometimes that they are sending me signals that I am not picking up and interpreting. Now, is that my imagination or does this really occur?
You mean in communication with them prior to being awarded a grant? Or
Yes, during sometimes it's a pre-application process. They may even hold a webinar on how to go about applying for their grant. And then during the application process, there'll be questions about how, I don't understand this question. I don't know how to answer this. And they just will not give you direct advice. And I guess I understand some of the reasons for that, but I often feel like I'm being sent signals and I'm not experienced enough to interpret what I'm hearing.
A lot of times they'll direct you to the Q&A. I just shared one with Jeff today, um, because for at least for a lot of the federal and state grants, especially the large ones, they have these Q&As and they won't allow questions. And I had this experience because when I first read the application, I reached out to the woman and just said, are school districts eligible to apply for this? That's all I was asking, because if we aren't eligible, we're not going to bother trying. And if we are eligible, tell me now. Don't tell me, 2 weeks before the application is due. She would not answer. And I went back to her. I was basically begging, saying, I'm just asking. She said I had to wait until the Q&A came out. So the Q&A actually came out this morning. I've been stalking, but they extended, and now they extended the date. I mean, school districts are eligible to apply, but she wouldn't even answer that question. And it was so frustrating because basically you're wasting my time. Like, just tell me yes or no. I'm not asking for any insight or, any special dispensation. Just, can we apply? And they wouldn't do it. So there could be reasons, and it's not like you're not picking up. They have their own reasons. And a lot of times they just want you, they're also understaffed. So, they want you to go back to the Q&A because your question is probably answered in the Q&A. You just have to go through 100 questions to get to your question. Um,
I will
but
tell Jane, though, that incident with T-Town, the rep would not answer the question. She did not know the answer on whether we had to have MWBE. She told me to go to the Department of Labor. And I did
Wow.
track down, now, not for anything, guys, Department of Labor, their whole job, or a good chunk of their job, is to enforce MWBE. So I knew I was, excuse me, screwed by making a contact at MW, at the Department of Labor. So I did track down the person who is the Hudson Valley, New York State Department of Labor. And they put the request through the process to determine whether this program needed to be MWBE. Now, but we knew the answer before I even called her. It's going to be required. I'm telling you, 99% of the times over the years that I've seen. Maybe somebody's been lucky. Jeff is nodding. Yeah. It's kind of a given. So, but there's ways, I don't want to say get around it, but there's
Well, you
ways
can, no,
to
there's
work with it.
forms. You can
Or
waive. I mean, you need to, it's like 10
of the way.
forms and this,
Mhm,
the superintendent has to sign off on every form and, we
mhm.
do it. But in our case, we do get it waived, so it's just annoying, but it can be done.
Yeah. Okay.
Agree.
It's just, like I come from a world where you ask a direct question, you get a direct answer. And this is just baffling to me.
Deb.
I thought I would just tell everybody that if you see somebody who you really think ought to be MWBE, there are women's enterprise development centers scattered throughout the state, and they are really, really helpful. They will make it easy for the person. Just connect them.
Great. I love that.
Mm.
And Jane, if you have questions, and you're not sure if you're missing something, bring those to the connections calls. If you're a member and you can jump on the connections call, you have like a plethora of knowledgeable people here, not me, but others who can answer your
Yes,
question
you.
and tell you, and can give you their feedback or their experience. So definitely, definitely don't be shy with that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well,
I will bend everybody's ear.
sounds good. We'll look forward to it. Well, thanks everyone for attending, and thank you so much, Helene and Jeffrey, for sharing your time and expertise. So much good information. And as a reminder, we will be in touch to share the program recording and materials, and I ask that you complete that survey. We look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.